Hey guys, it's Chelsea here, and I'm just popping in to let you know about a very exciting offer we're currently providing for our members of the Society at TFD, our exclusive community available to join here on YouTube or on Patreon. As you've probably noticed, we've recently partnered with Advisor.com, a company many of you guys have been loving. Instead of taking commissions or charging exorbitant percentage-based fees like many traditional financial advisors, Advisor.com provides their clients with a top-notch advising team for a fixed, flat annual fee. They put the possibility of financial planning within reach for those who don't already have millions in the bank, because they believe that getting to work with a living, breathing financial advisor should not be reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Their team of advisors work for you, not commissions, and will help you achieve your smart financial goals through planning, investing, tax strategizing, and more. And right now, they're providing an exclusive offer to members of the Society at TFD. Members can get $500 off of Advisor.com's annual fee by signing up with Advisor.com today. This offer applies to both existing members and those who join the Society today. When you join either here on YouTube or on Patreon, you can easily access your exclusive code by checking the Members tab here on YouTube or in the feed on your Patreon app. Remember, giving to TFD directly by joining the Society is the best way to guarantee that we can continue to make the content that you love. And now, in addition to our ad-free bonus videos, office hours with me, and our monthly book club, members can also get $500 off the annual fee with Advisor.com. Click the join button below to join the Society and get your exclusive offer code today. And today we are here to talk about McMansions and how we have McMansionified both where we live and how we live. Now, this is a subject that I have touched on here and there on the channel, especially when talking about sort of uniquely American ways of living that are really damaging to us in a lot of ways. But I wanted to do a specific video on the McMansion itself and kind of more importantly, how it has psychologically infiltrated the way we view things. Ultimately, where we live in a given society says so much about us, and it also determines what we think of as normal. And for me personally, when I look at a lot of the things in American life that are causing us harm, are causing us to overspend, are just generally not ideal, few things really typify that more than the McMansion and the lifestyle that it basically necessitates. So I want to do a deep dive into the McMansionification of American life, but first let's start by just establishing what is a McMansion, which I just can't do without shouting out one of my beloved blogs, McMansion Hell. Check it out, Kate Wagner, she's amazing, her work is amazing. But McMansions, when you break them down, are essentially the logical endpoint of a lot of uniquely American obsessions, this over-reliance on car culture, this need to live in large spaces, and paying for luxuries in a way that is, quite frankly, much cheaper than what they realistically should cost. And I should say, with regards to getting luxuries cheaply, that I don't want to necessarily victim blame, in the sense that many people who bought these McMansions were very much victims of the subprime mortgage industry, which we'll get into later. So people were being tricked into thinking that they could afford these things when the banks very well knew they couldn't. But it is still coming from an underlying desire to get a lot more than we need. But on a practical level, what actually is a McMansion? And yes, generally we know them when we see them. Here's a few examples. As Investopedia puts it, these homes are generally between 3,000 square feet and 5,000 square feet. The large home size is meant to signify the owner's high social and economic standing. And McMansions were most popular from the 1980s through the early 2000s before the crash of the housing market in 2008. McMansions are also known for their poor design. Some of the most common features of McMansions that are looked upon negatively are their oversized proportion in relation to the neighborhood, low-quality building materials used in construction, incongruous placement of windows, doors, columns, terraces, and porches, a poor mix of different architectural styles, usually historic, which makes for an odd appearance, and entrances and rooms with grand openings. Again, I cannot stress enough that if you want to just do a deep dive into the absolutely insane architecture happening in a lot of these McMansions, you must check out McMansion Hell. It is amazing. But as the name mansion might suggest, the most important feature of these cheaply built faux luxury homes is that they're huge. And while McMansions obviously took this trend to a bit of an extreme, especially in that heyday of the 90s and early 2000s, you can't say that they are what caused Americans' love of bigger homes. This is a trend that's been going on for decades, and it's kind of hard to understand why exactly Americans love big homes as much as they do. Now, we'll discuss some of the reasons why this might be, but it's important to establish that it's not just perception. When you look at the data, Americans really do love living in big homes compared to the rest of the world. As one article in The Atlantic put it, US houses are among the biggest, if not the biggest, in the world. It's not that the US has large houses because it has more land than other countries do. People intuitively often think that this is the explanation, because America is such a big country, Hurt told me. Well, this is true, but Russia is a big country. Kazakhstan is a big country. Space itself doesn't make people do one thing or the other. Government policies, however, do. As Hurt explains in her book Zoned in the USA, The Origins and Implications of American Land Use Regulation, the dictates of government have for the past century effectively steered Americans toward living in detached single-family homes, the formal term for a prototypical standalone house with a yard. Now, some of the more obvious theories as to why Americans outside of legislation do have a propensity for living in larger spaces is, for example, the extreme ubiquity and effective lobbying of car culture. I'll link you guys in the description to an episode of Too Good to Be True all about this subject. It's very fascinating. As well as a fear of crime in denser urban areas and a perception of safety in these more isolated suburban spaces. This was obviously typified by white flight in roughly the 60s to 90s, where wealthier, whiter residents of large urban centers moved out to the suburbs to escape, let's just say, changing demographics. And the media's portrayal as large homes as the norm, even for supposedly lower income families. Perhaps the most famous example of which being Homer Simpson, who by all standards lives in a bit of a castle, despite being portrayed as an average or even below average, a middle-class American father. Now, Americans do love big houses, but it's important to also note that it wasn't always this way, at least not to the same extent. Quote, over the last century, home sizes in the US have skyrocketed. In 1949, the typical single-family home was just 909 square feet. By 2021, it had shot up to 2,480 square feet. But interestingly, while home size in the US have gotten larger over time, lot sizes have shrunk over the years. In 1978, the median lot size for a US property was 18,760 square feet, but by 2020, this figure had dropped to a record low of 13,896 square feet. This is also something that is very prototypical of the McMansion, these absolutely massive homes built on tiny parcels of land. And it's also interesting to think in terms of the American dream, right? If you're going to chalk the large living spaces up to this American dream of going west, having your own home, being the ruler of your own domain, which is truly something that Americans have been sold as the ultimate expression of the American dream for centuries, essentially, it's interesting that this wouldn't necessarily translate into the land itself. While yes, there are still people who prioritize having a lot of acreage, when you look at the trends of home building, this just isn't the case, and McMansions in particular are an example of that. So when you look at these gigantic houses that have exploded in scale over the past several decades, you might be asking yourself, well, how in the world were people able to pay for those houses when over that same time period, wages have stagnated or dropped, and the cost of living has risen so dramatically? Well, the truth is that in many ways, McMansions both filled that need, i.e. the desire to get a lot of house for as little money as possible, and perpetuated the popularity of that dynamic. McMansions are, above almost anything else, built extremely cheaply and quickly, and pre-2008 crash were one of the most ideal and frequent candidates for subprime mortgages. So now we have to get into it, the subprime of it all, which, again, McMansions didn't start, but definitely exacerbated. So in many ways, the apex of McMansion culture, as not just the homes themselves, but the way of perceiving how we consume and what we're entitled to, not just in terms of the homes themselves, but in terms of how we perceive consumerism and what we think we should be able to afford with the money that we have, was everything leading up to the 2008 recession, including and especially the subprime mortgage crash. So first, we need to define what that was. So basically, according to Investopedia, the prime rate is the interest rate that commercial banks charge their most credit-worthy customers. The Federal Reserve System sets the federal funds overnight rate, which serves as the basis for the prime rate, which is the starting point for other interest rates on loans. Now, retail customers with good and strong credit histories who take out mortgages, small business loans, and car loans receive rates slightly higher than, but based on, the prime rate. However, applicants with low credit scores or other risk factors are offered rates by lenders that are significantly higher than the prime rate, hence the term subprime loan. Now, I could obviously spend hours going into the actual mortgage crash itself, how it worked, how these loans were being dealt out, how predatory they were, although I'll never do a better job than the movie The Big Short. Highly, highly recommend that movie to understand this entire system. But to get back to my earlier comment about not necessarily wanting to be too victim blamey when it comes to people who are buying McMansions, especially using subprime loans, it's important to note that these loans were in their very nature extremely predatory, lending to people that the banks knew on every level could not afford these mortgages. But the McMansions themselves were the ideal candidates for these types of loans and were disproportionately impacted by the crash. Now, this is for a few key reasons. They were cheap and quick to build, they were very popular with buyers, and they had appeal to the more subprime-ready consumer. But even knowing that these loans were predatory and that the banks had absolutely no business signing people to them, it's still important to talk about the underlying psychology here on the part of the buyer, which is needing to buy a lot for a lot less than it's worth. Because this is something that has infiltrated so many aspects of American consumerism. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But first, it is important to address that, especially in the past decade or so, we have seen a backlash to the McMansionification of our suburbs. Now, this is not to say that homes are suddenly small again. They're not. But it is to say that we have started to understand why this particular type of house is such an infection on communities. And that goes beyond just the buyers who were perhaps caught in predatory loans. Basically everything that can already be damaging about suburban sprawl, over-reliance on cars, separation from communities, extreme financial and ecological cost to support these homes, was very much typified and exacerbated by the McMansion. If it was already really expensive and energetically wasteful to heat and cool a giant home for a small family, this only gets worse when it's built with terrible building materials that don't insulate well. These large developments that have to pop up essentially in the middle of nowhere to support building so many extra large homes are going to be even less based around organic communities, even less walkable, even less filled with the kind of daily conveniences that improve quality of life. And it's even gotten to the point where the presence of McMansions actually drags down the property values around it. According to one article, the negative impact of McMansions can also be seen in their effect on property values. While it is often assumed that larger homes will lead to higher property values, this is not always the case. In many instances, the presence of McMansions can actually decrease the value of surrounding homes. This is because McMansions can detract from the character of the neighborhood, leading potential buyers to seek out other areas that feel more cohesive and welcoming. These developments are also typically heavy on lawns and light on any kind of more environmentally or socially beneficial greenery, like trees, wildflowers, or fruits and vegetables that the residents could eat, which is, it should also be noted, a more general American thing. Quote, lawns are so ubiquitous that the US claims an estimated 160,800 square kilometers of lawn space across the country, including parks and golf courses. That's basically the combined landmass of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. We might go into a whole other video about how terrible lawns are for the environment, but it's worth noting that McMansions only make that worse. And as I mentioned, when it comes to mental health, these McMansions are usually built in these very arbitrary, in the middle of nowhere developments that can accommodate them. Not built around any pre-existing town center or transit hub, meaning that they are usually prime candidates for an extreme lack of third places. Quote, in sociology, the third place refers to the social surroundings that are separate from the two usual social environments of home. Quote, first place, and the workplace, second place. Examples of third places include churches, cafes, clubs, public libraries, gyms, bookstores, stoops, and parks. In his book, The Great Good Place, Ray Oldenburg argues that third places are important for civil society, democracy, civic engagement, and establishing feelings of a sense of place. This lack of third places usually results in a lack of interaction with the community, a lack of walking time, and plenty of other side effects that just have a negative impact on physical and mental health. But as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, it's important to remember that even though McMansions are definitely on the decline, their impact on Americans' perception of space, of consumerism, of what things should cost is still very much a problem. One huge but often understated impact of Americans living in such big spaces is that they have to fill those spaces. That means doing things like bulk grocery shopping to fill the massive pantries that many American homes are now expected to come with, pantries that could easily stock a restaurant. It means having to buy furniture for many more rooms than Americans used to have, often rooms that don't even get used. This also means things like massive walk-in closets that can store multiple seasons worth of clothing at a given time and only further serve to normalize the quite damaging and relatively new relationship that Americans have to consuming fashion. As we've talked about on many other videos, we've gone from essentially buying one item of clothing every now and again to buying multiple new items of clothing a week on average. We do hauls, we shop at fast fashion, we expect to have a new outfit for every social media post and a new wardrobe for every season. And even if the rise of things like fast fashion and cheap consumer goods would have happened regardless, they're certainly made easier by having such large living spaces which don't just allow them, but almost necessitate them. Because why in the world would you have these enormous living spaces if you weren't actually filling them? For me, at the end of the day, the McMansionification of American life is very simple. It's a normalization of wanting more than we need and of paying less than it should cost. It's prioritizing cheap and easy over pricier but durable, and creating a feedback loop of having more so you constantly need more. While I'm certainly not here to say that we should never live in single-family homes, of course we can and we will for basically forever, as far as I can tell in America. There is a big difference between a single-family home that's built to the scale of an actual family and a single-family home that's built to the scale of senseless consumerism. As always, guys, thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and to come back every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday for new and awesome videos. Goodbye.